Hello, this is Michael Hart. I'm host of the Mike Hart Show, and you're listening to the Unknown America Project, myths and little known oddities about the greatest nation on earth, right here on the Heart of America YouTube channel. Tune in every single day at Heart, it's H-A-R-T, heartofamerica.net at 9 a.m. Eastern. That's 8 Central Time for the Michael Hart Show, right here on the Heart of America Network. One of the things that we like to discuss on this program frequently is the fact that if you want to understand the news of the day, you've got to go back in history. And we like to break down the news of the day through the prism of the past. In addition to the radio broadcast, I'm also the host of The Unknown America, myths and little known oddities about the greatest nation on earth. You can find this particular book that started it all at YouTube, Barnes & Noble, or wherever your favorite bookstores are sold, or right at the heartofamerica.net website. Today, we're going to talk about Russian meddling in American history. And one of the reasons I want to do this is for obvious reasons. We have the debacle of the Mueller report, the ongoing allegations of Russian collusion with the Trump administration. It's been absolutely nauseating to watch what's happened over the last years, and the just complete desperation of the Democrats to try to hang something on Donald Trump as it relates to Russian meddling and spying into American political system. But is it new? To go back in history, you have to go all the way back to 1917. And very frequently, when we're talking about things going on in the world around us today, 1917, 1913, 14, about the Woodrow Wilson administration time is pretty much the time that we like to visit. Now, I like to try to keep these things around 15 or 20 minutes, but there's a whole wealth of stuff that I want to get into today because I want to show you just how unbelievably widespread Russian meddling really is and has been for this nation's history, and how ridiculous the allegations against Trump really are. But to understand what's going on in this country today, again, we have to go back in history to about the year 1917. Now, you have to bear in mind, Woodrow Wilson is president. We're coming off the end of World War I. At this particular time in American history, Germany was just left in economic ravages, as was Russia. And what happens at this point in time, the Bolsheviks decide to push Tsar Nicholas out of office, or get him away from the monarchy, by forcing him to abdicate. And this is where all the problems began. Now, in our history books, we're taught that there was the Cold War. There's actually 3 Cold Wars in American history. The very first one actually beginning in 1917 at the conclusion of World War I. Shortly after World War I, also, we have the introduction of the idea of the League of Nations. And this is where a lot of this gets its start from. So what happens is the Bolsheviks, they come in, they want to force the monarchy of Tsar Nicholas II out of existence, forcibly asked him to abdicate his throne and power. At this point in time, the Russians get a provisional government that lasts about 8 months until Lenin took over, about 8 months after that. At this particular point in time, there's been a lot of steam and momentum for the introduction of the League of Nations, the forerunner to the United Nations. Many people in American history think that Woodrow Wilson was responsible for the League. Well, he was a big proponent of it, but actually it came out of Europe. There was a lot of congressional isolationists at this time that were adamantly opposed to it. Now, the idea behind the League of Nations was that there would never again be in the future of the world another world war. Well, we saw exactly how well that worked out. The League of Nations was an abject failure. But what is interesting is, although Wilson was very supportive of it, the Russians also were not in it, nor was America, because of these isolationists in Congress. What this meant was, as loose a confederation as the League of Nations was, there was no participation between the Russians and the Americans. Up to this point in American history, under Tsar Nicholas, the Russians really didn't care that much about what was going on in America. It was something far afield to them. But at the end of the war, again, they're in shambles. The Bolshevik revolution actually occurs, and a very heated relationship began. The first Cold War in America between Americans and the Russians, beginning in 1917 and lasting to about 1933. A lot of people also don't know that during this period of time of revolution in Russia, Woodrow Wilson dispatched about 8,000 United States troops to fight the Russians in Serbia. So the relationship was very, very, very contentious. Also, during the first Cold War, 1917 and 1933, the United States did not formally recognize Moscow as a sovereign nation. They thought that the monarchy had been ended illegally, and I guess technically you can make the argument that it did. But this is where we get the start of all the Russian meddling, the accusations of collusion, etc. It's also worth noting, as we break this down a little bit today, that in history, Americans have actually done more meddling and more surveillance or espionage in Russia than they have actually perpetrated against us. But it's very instructive to realize that the relationship between the Americans and the Russians was highly damaged. The Russians knew that somehow they had to implement some kind of strategy of data collection. And this is when, in American history, it actually began. The second Cold War begins around 1948 or so, and then lasts about 1988, with the third one beginning in the late 1990s, but during around the time that Clinton had signed certain legislation that impacted the relationship between the Russians and the Americans. Although the third Cold War could be considered, well, not as chilly as the first two. It's also interesting to note that many historians, despite all the concerns about the Cold War, they've come to the conclusion that there probably never would have been any kind of military intervention. So all those drills when you were in elementary school, hiding under your desk from the nuclear bomb, as though that would have been effective, was really folly and a waste of time. But there's also this notion that we have the so-called Cold Wars, both of them in this case, the first two at least, that there was the Cold War was because there was no fighting, but yet there was. It was just pretty much behind the scenes. It's extremely instructive to realize that during this period of time, spying was absolutely rampant between these two countries. If you look at what happens all the way up into the League of Nations, which we get the implementation of the League of Nations in about 1920. Again, this is an attempt to keep all these nations communicating. The lines are open so that there's some way for us to air our differences, if you will, in a very, very public forum. An absolute dismal failure. But in addition to that, in addition to the fact that Woodrow Wilson had sent troops into Serbia to fight during the Russian Revolution, few people know that there was an organization called the Comintern, which was kind of an abbreviation for Communist Internment or International in the United States of America. The Communist Party in America was very alive and very vibrant during this period of time, sponsored by Moscow. Moscow had to know what was going on in this country. So what we see taking place here is the Russians dispatching people all across all spectrums of American culture, all the way up until about 1933. What happens in 1933 is that Hitler begins to come on the scenes. Now, Hitler was also a byproduct of World War I and the reparations placed against Germany during the Treaty of Versailles. The country is bankrupt. This is what gives rise to Adolf Hitler at this time. So we have some cooling of temps between the Americans and the Russians from 1933 until about 1945 or so, when we get the introduction of the United Nations. But the spying was set in place because it's at this time that the Russians had gained a lot of information from American double agents that were in various aspects of our community and culture. Interestingly enough, most of the Russian spying was actually coming out of Canada, because you had people in the Canadian embassy, the Russian embassy in Canada, that were actually spying on the activities and actions in the United States of America. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that there's all this talk about meetings and the Trumps and everything that's going on in terms of the Russians. And of course, Putin tried to infiltrate. But during this period of time, we had Russian spies in our school systems, our universities. Got to remember, this is part of the Communist Party that was alive and well in post World War II America, sponsored by the Russians. Almost every single Russian in the United States Embassy in DC was, in fact, some form of a spy. They were there for information gathering purposes to impact our elections and to impact our policy. There's also a lot of discussion today about people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and having these enclaves of Muslims in certain parts of the country, Minneapolis. And in the 1940s and 50s, this same thing is going on as it relates to the Communist Party, trying to infiltrate American politics through a variety of many mechanisms. Again, in academia, the Red Scare during the McCarthy era was people that were in the entertainment industry that were called out as being communist. And although the practices of McCarthy were barbaric at times, and certainly one could call archaic today, he was not entirely incorrect, because there was the discovery not just of these operatives in our schools and in our media, and even propagandizing in terms of books that were in public libraries, but we even found one, according to one Canadian operative, Russian Canadian operative, they were in the State Department as well as the DOJ of the United States, posing as officers of the United States federal government. Now, while this is going on, the United States is blasting by shortwave radio back to Moscow certain music and information channels that Russians were so desirous of, because they were kind of like the North Koreans at this time with the Hermit Kingdom, that they wanted this information. So very illegally, they would tune into these stations. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s, one of the most popular bands for Russians was the Beatles. The stations out of America would broadcast into Russia Beatles music, and at the end of a song or two would then lay down some kind of message of propaganda. Simultaneously, the Russians were doing the same thing in American journalism. There was one Russian who was actually a spy in Tokyo that posed as he was actually posing as a Nazi journalist in Tokyo to get information on the Russians in America. This guy was actually the inspiration for James Bond. He was found some years later and executed. But here we are in the McCarthy era. We are post-World War II. Now, all of a sudden, there seems to be some détente, if you will, between the Russians and the United States. But during the war years, they really amped up the strategies that they had developed during the first Cold War. So here we have 1945, the United Nations comes online, and all of a sudden it absolutely explodes with people within the United Nations staffing offices also working as operatives in the USSR. The United States government was well aware that this was actually going on. But where it really gets interesting and it becomes a little more modernized is the fact that although there were infiltrators in the movie industry, in the music industry, in academia, in our school books, and so many other places that would have been predating our current situation of social media, but there was something that the Russians discovered, and they really doubled down on it in the late 1950s and 60s, when we see the ascendancy, if you will, of Jack Kennedy in American politics. When Kennedy takes office, he is considered by Nikita Khrushchev to be weak, vacillating, and feckless. Now, of course, we learned through history that Khrushchev pretty much misjudged Mr. Kennedy. But it's no mystery that Jack Kennedy liked the ladies, and he liked the ladies an awful lot. And he used to frequent a club in DC called the Quantum Club. Now, he was involved with several different several paramours, if you will, throughout the course of his relationship with Jackie. she knew about it. She did nothing about it because, frankly, it was a different place and time, and it wasn't spoken of in polite company, if you will. But at this point in time, at the Quantum Club was a young woman by the name of Ellen. And Ellen's last name is Romech. Ellen Romech, and this is a picture of her. Ellen Romech is actually a prostitute working in the Quantum Club as a waitress and a prostitute. Jack Kennedy, well, let's just say he falls for old Ellen here. Ellen also happened to have been a Russian spy of East German descent. She was sent to the United States of America to gather as much information as she could. Is it interesting to note, or is it even remotely coincidental about all the sex scandals that we're having in America today? And that, frankly, were very prevalent even then, although they were unspoken. Now, it would be unfair to old Ellen here to imply that Jack Kennedy was her only liaison. It was a known fact that Ellen Romech was betting as many American diplomats as she possibly could, in part to get information that she was feeding back to the Kremlin. And also, it was used as a form of bribery. Ellen was, quite prolific in her behaviors, but this didn't just end there. And another aside to this is Bobby Kennedy actually told Jack Kennedy that a lot of these women you're running around with, that old Jackie boy was meeting at the club, that they were in fact Russian spies and possibly even Nazi spies, as the Nazis were trying to grow their communist influence in the United States at this time. Because the Nazis were beginning to adopt more of a communist viewpoint as their fascist roots, began to fall to the wayside. So now we got the Nazis here, we got the Russians here, and they're employing these young women to beguile these gentlemen in places of politics in Washington, D.C., a condition that I might argue continues on to this day. So Bobby tells Jack, you got to cut it off with Ellen here. And, well, Jack doesn't. So RFK has Ellen Romech actually deported from the United States of America. But there was certainly others. At this time, the Russians also understand the amazing importance and the power of getting people here in the United States, in our universities, for the purposes of not just indoctrinating young people, but spreading the propaganda that would influence their political views. This is very similar to what's going on with our social media in this country today. But it continues on. As recently as the year 2010, this young woman is actually arrested in Washington, D.C. Her name is Anna Chapman. Anna was arrested in New York City working as an actress. Turns out she was a Russian spy. Now, she was in a lot of real low-grade movies and actually worked as an actress in Russia as well. But the point I'm making is that many of these spies that we've seen are, in fact, female. They do, in fact, bed a lot of these politicians. And the reality of it is that we also have them in our university system. We have it in form of propaganda and eavesdropping. You know, a lot of people, even when I bring these things up, they sometimes say to me, well, Michael, you're being a little too conspiratorial. It couldn't possibly be that way. Well, let's remember this particular picture of Ellen. This is a picture of Ellen that was published some years ago in an expose that was done by Life magazine. You see, the stuff has been out there for many, many, many years, but people simply do not pay attention to it because of the political climate and the sexuality of today. So we've got spies in the Department of Justice, not currently, but back during World War II. We have spies to our north in Canada. Pretty much you have spies dispatched all over this country, possibly to the tune of 100, 200, maybe 300,000. And they work in restaurants in D.C., and they work in movie theaters. They're in the movie industry. They're cab drivers. The Russians have been doing this for the better part of the last 100 years, particularly at the conclusion of World War II. but dating all the way back to 1917. It's absolutely immature and naive to believe for a single moment that there was Russian collusion between the Trump administration and the Russians. It simply is not the way they roll. They have moles all across this nation and almost every aspect of our life and our lifestyles here in America, but primarily in places like Washington, D.C. and New York City, and legions of young women. It would be a very safe bet on my part to say that half the hookers in D.C. are on some government's payroll. And I am not exaggerating about that. Furthermore, implying that the Russians would need Donald Trump to fix the election in 2016, the Russians needed Trump like Jeffrey Epstein needs a new girlfriend. It simply is not the case. They would not have needed him. They never would have met with him. It is so easy to install a mole, whether it be in D.C. or a restaurant or wherever the case may be, because historically speaking, they have proven their willingness to do so. It's been documented. It's been detailed. Now enter 2016, specifically as it relates to social media. The Russians actually had a social media campaign in their own country, propagandizing to their own people, as early as the 1940s. They understood, like the Americans did, who were blasting the Beatles music. And by the way, when the Beatles fell out of favor, next up was Elton John. Them Ruskies loved them some Elton John. And the United States government pipes this information in there via shortwaves. The Russians eat it up and then get an editorial. But this never comes to light because then there has to be the admittance by the Americans that we're spying on the Russians. But now you have social media. And then what was it just a few weeks ago we learned about the Face app, where you take a picture of yourself and then it ages you. And as you apply this application, we find out the Russians are behind it and they're gathering all your social information, your contact information, sharing that and disseminating it for the purposes of crafting the narrative. They don't need to get to the president of the United States. The Russians know more about what's going on in the halls of Congress than people in the halls of Congress, including the congressmen and women that reside there. So it's completely fanciful to believe that that was ever the case. But we do know that there are several computer programs and worms and gathering devices on your computers, on your phones, and whatever tablet or device you choose to use that are being hacked by the Russians for the purposes of gathering information so they can create via our own American news media false narratives that could bring down a president, that could shore up a president. And how many times have we talked about in the Michael Hart Show and the daily broadcast the frequency of inaccuracy in history and history reporting? Many of the textbooks in the United States of America to this day are actually published by the European press. They do so for a variety of different reasons, but there always seems to be a pro-English slant towards what's being presented because they're the ones that are producing the content. And that's the reason we call this the Unknown America Project. But rest assured, my friends, the simple reality of it is the Russians never would have needed Donald Trump. They certainly would not have met with Donald Trump because for all we know, there are already people in the White House that perhaps have been there for even years. They can be the lawn boy. They can be the chauffeur. They can be national security. How many FBI agents and CIA agents, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg come to mind, have we revealed over the years that were working as double agents for the Russians that had access to United States information for the purposes of influencing our elections or our policy? The Russians never would go after Donald Trump or his families simply because they never did. They never showed a proclivity towards it. And back in the day when all the information gathering had to be done in clandestine methods, whether it would come from a waiter or chauffeur or some hooker in D.C., now we have social media where as Americans, we are all too willing to volunteer our personal information, our political leanings, desires, or proclivities for them to gather that information to use it against us in future elections. The Russian spying's not going away. Quite frankly, the arguments about collusion probably never will as well, because the Democrats are correct. The Russians did try to influence the elections in 2016 because they've attempted to influence every election since 1917. And that influence and those attempts will continue on unabated as long as we can, on the face of this earth. The only thing that's going to change is the expediency and the efficiency and the speed at which they are able to do it via the cyber and internet world that we live in today. So regardless of where you come down on the debate of Russian collusion, know two things. It does happen. It did happen. And the likelihood that Trump knew it occurred is probably extremely unlikely because, like I said, he would have been one of the last people they would have deferred to because the president of the United States didn't know nothing they didn't already know in Moscow. You've been listening to The Heart of America right here on the Heart of America YouTube channel. Please share this video so we can get this information out to let people know what's going on. In future editions, I will get deeper into this stuff and name even more names, but I've had several requests to keep these videos as short as I possibly can to give you kind of an aerial overview of what's going on. But share it on your social media. We're going to do a couple of these every single week and bring them to you so that we can give you the unknown America myths and little known oddities about the greatest nation on earth. And make sure to tune in to the Michael Hart Show on the Heart of America Broadcast Network at heartofamerica.net, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern, 8 Central. And thanks for tuning in.